Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Now, we're going to try to get through chapters 29 to 33. They're kind of short chapters, however, they are impactful. They are the last days of Saul. You could almost say it's God now ending the last days of Saul and preparing to transfer the kingdom over to David. But if you remember, the last time we left David, he now is in a very awkward position because to flee Saul, he went to live on to the Philistines. And if you remember, his plan was he's going to live on the outskirts of the Philistines to just kind of keep out of sight. And then all of a sudden the Philistines decide they're going to attack Israel. This is God's decree because he's going to judge Israel for their sins. And so David now is in a very strange position because Achish the king, one of the leaders, is saying, hey, you're going to be my bodyguard. You're going to fight with us. Now, David is actually now getting ready to fight against the very nation he's going to rule. And that's because he didn't see God in making his decision to say, Lord, what should I do? Saul is trying to kill me. What should I do? David made the decision, and in his mind, I'm just going to hang out on the outskirts of the Philistines. And all of a sudden, he's pulled even closer in. Kind of, as I said, it kind of reminded me of Lot. We see Lot on the outskirts of Sodom. Next thing you know, he's inside of Sodom, and now he's in the very integral part of Sodom. David now is being drawn in. That you have to ask yourself, if I was there to say, David, are you actually going to fight against your nation? Really? You're going to actually go to war against your nation? Let alone the nation you're going to be king over. Okay, so let's get into it. Chapter 29. It says, the Philistines brought all of the army's units together at Aphek while Israel was camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine leaders were passing in review with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were passing in review behind them with Achish. Now, again, this is so bizarre right here because, again, now, I'll say this, as I said, when we are foolish, God's mercy, and thank God for his mercy. Look at verse 3. Then the Philistines' commanders asked, what are these Hebrews doing here? The ones you're getting ready to go to war with. Achish answered the Philistines' commander, that is David, servant of King Saul of Israel. He has been with me a considerable period of time, and from the day he has defected until today, I found no fault with him. The Philistines' commanders, however, were enraged with Achish and told him, send that man back and let him return to his place that you assigned him. He must not go down with us into battle only to become our adversary during battle. What better way could he regain his master's favor than with the heads of our men? Isn't this David they sing doing their dances? Saul has killed his thousands and David is 10,000. Now, yeah, right, common sense here. But watch David's response. Again, I think David is kind of in a very kind of crazy kind of moment here. Verse 6. So Achish summoned David and told him, as the Lord lives, you are an honorable man. I think it's good to have you working with me in the camp because I found no fault in you from the day that you came to me until today. But the leaders don't think you are reliable. Go back quietly and you won't be doing anything the Philistine leaders think is wrong. But what have I done? David replied to Achish, from the first day I was with you until today, what have I found against your servant to keep me from going along and fighting against the enemies of my lord the king? Now, this is so bizarre here, because David, you're actually here kind of fighting here, or lobbying to fight to fight with the enemy. One, the extreme evil pagans; two, the enemies of Israel, against the nation you're going to be king with. And it's almost kind of like David's kind of like in this despair of thinking, it's like, nobody wants me, right? I mean, man, what the heck? Verse 9. But watch this. And then secondly, God has given you made a dumb mistake. God has given you the opportunity to kind of exit out of here. Go gracefully while you can, right? Verse 9. Achish answered David, I'm convinced that you are as reliable as the angels of God, but the Philistines' commanders have said, he must not go to battle with us. So get up early in the morning, you and your master's servants who came with you. And when you have gotten up early, go as soon as it's light. So David and his men got up early in the morning and returned to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel, to fight against David's nation. This is a part, again, it kind of to me seems that this is just sort of has he sunk more in disparity, like lost his way. And I think in this chapter here, God is really going to be like, okay, we need to occupy David. Let's give him something to get his attention on, because he's really going to mess up, right? Remember when he came across Abigail, and Abigail said to him, don't do something that you would regret later. Could you imagine if David had fought? Could you imagine if David had fought in the war against the Philistines? How would that look? As Saul is defeated, and now, hey, guess what? We're going to make you king, David. All right, verse 1. This is rough. Okay, David and his men arrived at Ziklag. On the third day, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and attacked and burned down Ziklag. They also had kidnapped the women and everyone in it, from the youngest to the oldest. They'd killed no one, but had carried them off. And as they went on their way, when David and his men had arrived to the town, they found it burned down. Their wives, sons, daughters had been kidnapped. David and the troops with them wept loudly until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives, Ahinoam and the Jezreelite, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had also been kidnapped. And David was in a difficult position because the troops talked about stoning him, for they were all very bitter over the loss of their sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. So now he's kind of gonna come back, right? But think about this now. While they were gone on the side of the enemy, all of a sudden their camp was attacked. Now, kind of what's of note here is that he said they didn't kill them. That's probably with a normal routine, just kill everybody. David had done that, right, as he raided the outskirts of the Philistine land. And he kept that secret from Achish, by the way, just as a side note, remember. That's why he killed everyone. And then when they would ask him, I was just raiding over here, but he killed everyone. But they were Philistines that he killed. And now all of a sudden they get back, and all of a sudden David, it's your fault. They were talking about stoning him. Now, if you also remember the troops, a lot of these troops that were with David were people of malcontent, undesirable people. Verse 7, David said to Abiathar, the priest, son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought him, and David asked the Lord. Now, this is right here what David should have done with the whole Philistine thing. Should I pressure these raiders, Will I overtake them? Well, I'm sorry. Will I pursue these raiders? Will I overtake them? The Lord replied to him, pursue them, for you will certainly overtake them and rescue them. And I think David was like, I think the Lord was really saying, okay, we need to give David something to do because he's really getting ready to get in some serious trouble here. Verse 9. David and 600 men with him went as far as the Wadi Bezar, where 200 men who were to remain behind would stop. They stopped because they were too exhausted to cross the Wadi Bezar. David and 400 of the men continued in pursuit. They found an Egyptian in an open country and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink, and they gave him some pressed figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And after he ate and revived, for he hadn't eaten food or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights, and David said to him, who do you belong to and where are you from? I'm an Egyptian, the slave of Amalekite man, he said. My master abandoned me when I got sick 3 days ago. We raided the south country of the Cheretite, the territory of Judah, and the south of Caleb, and we burned down Ziklag. And David then asked him, will you lead me to these raiders? He said, swear to me by God that you won't kill me or turn me over to my master, and I will lead you to them. So he led them, and there were the Amalekites spread out over the entire area, eating and drinking and celebrating because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and the land of Judah. David slaughtered them from twilight unto the evening the next day. None of them escaped except 400 young men who got on camels and fled. And David recovered everything from the Amalekites had taken, and he rescued his 2 wives. And nothing of theirs was missing, from the youngest to the oldest, including the sons and daughters of all of the plunder the Amalekites had taken. David got everything back. Like I said, it kind of showed me that God was giving him this. God was actually giving him this attention here, so to keep David out of the way. But it does show this kind of, in movie fashion, historic. He come and he rescues his wives and children, took all the stuff back. Verse 20. He took all the sheep and cattle which were driven ahead of the other livestock, and the people shouted, this is David's plunder. When David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to go with him and had been left at the Wadi Bezar, they came out to meet him and to meet the troops with him. And when David approached the men, he greeted them. But all of the corrupt and worthless men among those who had gone with David argued, because they didn't go with us, we would not give any of the plunder we recovered to them, except each man's wife and children, and they may take them and go. Now again, you see, not every man that was with David was godly, and we'll see this even more so later on. David will be a good king, a righteous king, but not everyone with him felt the same. Verse 23, but David said, my brothers, you must not do this what the Lord has given us. He's protected us and handed over to us the raiders which came against us. Who can agree to your proposal? The share of one who goes into battle is to be the same as the share of the one who remains with the supplies, and they will share equally. Now this is something in which you see, and this is a rare show of good leadership, just leadership. Verse 25, as it has been so from that day forward, David established this policy as a law and an ordinance for Israel, and it continued to this very day. When David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to his friends and elders of Judah, saying, here is a gift for you from the plunders of the Lord's enemies. He sent gifts to those in Bethel, Ramoth, and Negev, and to Jatir, to those in Arur, and Sepharmoth, and to Estemoa. To those in Rakah, the towns of Jerahmeelites, in the towns of Canaanites, and to those of Harmites, and Borshan, and Antioch, and those of Hebron, and to those in all the places where David and his men had roamed. Now, again, sorry for butchering all those names. And it's kind of interesting here. We see David getting back into the Israel kind of thing here. Okay. And all right, so chapter 31, and this is going to be again the sad ending of Saul. But even sadder, we're going to see that this is going to be the ending of Jonathan. Verse 1. The Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them, and many were killed on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons and killed his sons Jonathan, Ahimadad, and Malchua. And when the battle was intensified against Saul, the archers caught up with him and severely wounded him. And then Saul said to the armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me." But his armor-bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. Now I want you to remember this scene right here, because when we get into 2 Samuel, this is going to come back right here. But remember how Saul died. Now, a couple of things that's sad. One, Jonathan, because Jonathan, we could say from how the story's unfolded to us, Jonathan didn't do anything wrong. But yet we see God judging Saul's line. Okay? And there is a good reason for this, that had Jonathan lived, had any of his sons lived, they would have been a stumbling block. And we will see this in the next story, how that there are people, there will be this contention between the house of Saul, those remnants of the house of Saul, and David. Okay. All right. So another thing is that, notice Saul took his own life, and I say that because this is Saul's last evil act. Okay. This is his last evil act. Verse 6, verse 5, when the armor-bearer saw, let's see. Verse 5, when the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. Now again, keep this in mind, how Saul died. File that. Again, we'll come back to that when we get into 2 Samuel next study. Verse 6, so on that day Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men. And when the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that Israel's men had run away, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. So the Philistines came and settled in them. The next day the Philistines came to strip the dead, and they found Saul and his 3 sons dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the good news in their temples of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth and hung his body on the wall of Basra. And when the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the brave men set out, journeyed all night, and they retrieved the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. And when they had arrived at Jabesh, they burned their bodies there. And afterwards, they took their bones and buried them under the tarmash tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So we see the tragic end of Saul. This is the end of 1 Samuel. Now, as I said in the original, it is believed, at least the original writings of Saul, that this was all one book, First and Second Samuel. So we would actually be, you can say, we'd be ending in section 1, because we're now going to transfer from the kingdom of Saul into the kingdom of David. How God is, he judged the wickedness of Saul and the tragic death here. And again, Jonathan to me is the collateral damage in that. Now, let me also say that even though I'm saying that, Jonathan, it seemed like, he's the collateral damage, we just don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us all, by the way, about why God would include him in that death. One of the main reasons we do know, as I said, is that especially somebody like Jonathan, how you will have men who would have rallied around to try to keep Saul's kingdom going. So we're going to see this throughout our study as we go from kingdom to kingdom here through the Kings, right? Chronicles, you see, best we get to the Kings, you see how political the Kings, the writing of the Kings are, and we will see how it's you don't want the trouble. Even though David is going to have it, there's always going to be, we're going to see years later that there are people sympathetic to Saul. And if I may end with this note, we kind of see it now, don't we? How that there are people who are sympathetic to the prior president. Okay? All right, they won't let it go. But anyway. All right, guys, look, 2 Samuel in our next study, the kingdom of David. All right, see you then.